Today, I'm going to go over the top 5 most important functions that ChatGPT thinks users in Excel should know how to use. So I recently asked ChatGPT this question, and here are its answers. I'm going to go over how to use these functions as well. So number 1 was the sum function. So the sum function is a really simple function that just tabulates a total value of numbers. So in this example here, I've got my dollar amount for expenses in column D. So if I just wanted to total this up, I would use the sum function and just specify that range. So selecting everything in there. So a really simple function, just takes that one argument. Now the sum function is so common that there's even an auto sum option here. So if I click on this, it's going to automatically create that sum function and detect my range. So it's a really easy function to use in Excel, and they've made it even easier by just having that auto sum capability. Just basically insert that below your range, and Excel's going to automatically detect what range you're probably going to want to add up. So this is a really basic function that beginners should be familiar with, especially when they're starting out with Excel. Number 2 is the if statement. So ChatGPT thinks the if statement is important because it introduces users to decision-making capabilities into spreadsheets. So it allows the ability to create dynamic formulas to produce different outcomes based on their data. So how might we use an if statement here? So here I've got an expense report or a list of expenses. And what I'm going to do is use an if statement to flag large expenses. So I'm going to insert a column here, and I'm going to add a field, say large transaction question mark, right? I want to see, okay, is this a large transaction? And let's say my threshold is $100. I want to know anything over $100. I'm going to say, okay, that's a large transaction. So to do that, I'm going to use the if statement. My logical test is the main thing that's going to be driving this calculation. And then if that test is true, if that condition is met, then it's going to return this value. And if it's not met, if it's false, it's going to return this value. So my logical test here is going to be, okay, if this value is greater than $100, then I'm going to say it's a large transaction. So what I can do here, I'm going to put comma, and then for the value, if it's true, I'm just going to put an X in quotation marks. And if it's false, just 2 quotes to say, okay, a blank value. So now I flagged everything that's over $100. So now if I wanted to, I can use this list here to filter it. Boom, I've got all my large transactions. So a really easy way to use an if statement to be able to flag things without having to do conditional formatting or anything complex like that. Just a simple if statement. And obviously this can get a lot more complicated if you've got nested if statements, but knowing the if statement is very important just because it allows you to build more complex formulas, use more advanced logic in your spreadsheets as well. The next most important function ChatGPT thought users should know is how to do a VLOOKUP or an XLOOKUP if you've got a newer version of Excel, if you're running Office or Microsoft 365. So instead of mapping large transactions, I'm going to delete this and say I want to flag or I want to match up the employee to their department. So I've got my lookup table here. So I'm going to look at the values in the name column and link them up to the department that they're in. So I'm going to call this department. And if I'm doing a VLOOKUP, it's a really simple function where we're just taking our value that we're looking for, and then in the table that we're looking up, we're specifying that entire table, and then so we're going to select the value and then select the table. And then the column index number, that is going to be the second column that we're extracting the values from. And I'm looking for an exact match. So I'm going to set that to 0 or false. So now I've got my lookup. I can see Olivia Smith is in the accounting department. So the VLOOKUP works well. Now there's actually a couple drawbacks of VLOOKUP, and one is that you have to specify a column number. So if you've got a really complex VLOOKUP function, it's easy to get lost in it and know whether you're referencing the right column, whether it's column, let's say 11 or 12, or should it be 15, right? So in large spreadsheets, it can be really easy to make a mistake that way. And also another limitation is you're going from left to right. If the name was in this field and the department was over here, I couldn't go from right to left. So my lookup table always has to be the values that I'm looking up in the leftmost column. So that's a bit of a limitation of VLOOKUP. And that's why Excel came out with XLOOKUP. And so let's do this with XLOOKUP. So XLOOKUP works in a similar way. We specify the value, but instead of selecting the table, we're just selecting first our lookup array. So this is the array where we're going to look for this value. And then we've got our return array. This is where we're going to pull the values from. So this is a bit of a cleaner formula to set up. And I don't have to count columns. I don't have to worry about going left to right. I specify to search in this column and retrieve values from this other column. So it makes it really simple. But if you're not running Office 365, you don't have the latest version of Excel, then you're going to want to use VLOOKUP. But if you have XLOOKUP, obviously you can use that and make your life a bit easier. Next, the fourth function that ChatGPT listed that users should know how to use is the COUNTIF/SUMIF function. So let's group those into two, but it's a similar sort of process anyway. So I'm going to show you how we can do this. So here we've got names, departments, and I'm going to have a list of, let's say, the number of transactions and then total value, right? So we can count the number of times that these names appear in this list and the total value of those. So for the COUNTIF function, all we're specifying is the range that we're looking at. So we're looking at this column for the name and how many times this name shows up there. Hit enter. And so we can see Isabella Rodriguez had the most number of transactions at 10. So it's doing a count based on that criteria. So it's again using that if functionality to use some logic in there. Now for the SUMIF function, it works in a similar way where we're going to specify the range for our criteria and then a sum range. So it's a little bit more complex because it is an additional argument here. But what we're looking at is the same thing. We're looking at that range where that name is a match, but we're summing up the value in column D. So now we can see that's the total value of those transactions based on these different people. So that's how the SUMIF function works. So that's another common one that Excel users will want to be familiar with. That's often used in Excel spreadsheets. Last on this list, the ChatGPT gave me of 5 most important functions is index and match. So again, it kind of cheated here and gave me 2 functions here. And index and match is really useful because it says combine these functions overcome the limitations of VLOOKUP, such as inflexible column indexing and the inability to look left of the key column. Now, as mentioned before, if you're running Office 365, you've got the latest version of Excel, you can use XLOOKUP. You don't even need index and match. But let's say you are using an older machine, an older version of Excel, and you don't have access to XLOOKUP. In that case, then index and match can help you out in that situation. So let's take a look at how that might work. So I'm going to clear this department lookup one more time. And what I'm going to do is flip this table around. So I'm going to cut, insert, cut cell. So I've got the department and the name. So now I cannot do a VLOOKUP because I can't take this value and go from left to right, because if I want the department's over here, right? So I need to go from right to left. I can't do that with VLOOKUP. Let's say I don't have access to XLOOKUP. So now let's see how index and match works. So with the index and match combination, we're first creating the index function, opening that up, and basically this array, this is where we want the values to come from. So this is going to be, think of our results array when using XLOOKUP. So the results are the department. I want to pull the department value, so that's going to be my array. I don't have to include the entire table because my results are just going to come from this column. Now, I need to specify which row number in this column I want to pull. So this is where the match function comes into play. So I'm going to use the match function, which acts as a lookup again. So we're looking up a value within an array, and we're finding that match. So it's going to tell us, whether it was the first item in that list, whether it was second, third, and so on. So I'm going to specify the name that I'm looking up, And then my lookup range is going to be here in column H. And the match type, I'm specifying 0 for an exact match. And so now the last argument is my column number. And that column number is referring to my index. So remember, I only specified one column for my index, so I can only have column number 1. I don't have multiple columns in my index. If I specify 2 or 3 or anything greater than 1, it's going to give me an error saying, okay, I didn't include that many in my index. So to keep it simple, I always just specify one column when setting up my index and match. And so that way my column number is always going to be 1 as well. So now if I close this out, my formula works. So let's go through and see how it works. So I'm going to go evaluate. And so we're specifying that table. So it's going G2 to G11, which is my department here. And then it's doing a match for that name within the name field. And it tells me that it's the 9th value within this range, right? So it correctly tells me that Olivia Smith is in the accounting department. So I've been able to go from right to left. So I've overcome that limitation of VLOOKUP, because VLOOKUP can't help me here if I don't have the latest version of Excel. And if my table is formatted this way, then if I want to go from right to left, then I have to use index and match. So those are the 5 most important functions or combinations, let's say, that ChatGPT said were the most important for users. So we had the sum function, the if function, VLOOKUP/XLOOKUP, COUNTIF/SUMIF, and then index and match as well. So I think if you know those 5 combinations, or those 5, well, I guess a bit more than 5 functions in Excel, then I think you're well on your way to at least being a very good intermediate Excel user, potentially advanced user, if you've got those functions down. So I think those are definitely key functions to focus on when you're learning Excel. So I think ChatGPT got it right in identifying the most important functions for users to be able to know.